Poilievre seems like a villain in a Karate Kid movie. There's something very, very off-putting.
Jon Stewart on The Daily Show clowned Canadian Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre and talked Canadian politics with potentially the next leader of the Liberal Party, Mark Carney. So, I want to get into this because this was, I got to say, a stunning interview for me. I was not expecting to come out of this liking Mark Carney as much as I did, but I'm going to play for you a few clips, and I think if you go into this with a clear mind, you're going to see the potential here in Mark Carney. So I want to be clear. This is still a liberal. There are limitations on the kinds of things that a liberal is going to do. They are not going to institute the kind of universal programs that I would like to see as somebody who leans more to the left. That said, when it comes to combating someone like a Pierre Poilievre and comparing Carney to someone like Trudeau, I think Carney stands out as somebody who comes off as more of a person than a rehearsed politician. So before I get into the first clip, I just want to quickly show you here the state of Canadian politics right now, where this is the current polling projection from CBC News. So Conservatives are leading by quite a bit with Pierre Poilievre there as the leader. Of course, Trudeau has recently said he will step down once a new Liberal Party leader is chosen in an upcoming leadership race. But this amounts to what is projected currently, if an election were held today, the Conservative Party, in their worst case scenario, still winning a majority government, which is insane. Showing you just how bad things are for the governing Liberal Party right now. So let me get to the first clip, because again, I was not expecting a whole lot here. We're talking about Mark Carney is the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, somebody who is traditionally, you'll see here, he calls himself an outsider. I think that clip's coming up later. He is kind of when it comes to electoral politics, but he's not really an outsider in terms of, the system. That said, when you have Pierre Poilievre on the other side, somebody who is a career politician and has only worked on behalf of large corporations and against the working class, it kind of cancels itself out. So I want to get to the first clip here. This is more about the demeanor of Mark Carney, and just if you put this guy up against Trudeau or Pierre Poilievre, again, he stands out as somebody who is actually a person.
What are they making up there of the overtures and sort of trolling to Canada about being a part of the United States?
Well, I mean, the bottom line is not going to happen. The overture. I mean,
because you don't want.
Well, we're we're proud. We find you very attractive, but we're not moving in with you. It's not you. It's us. We do things a little differently in Canada. We believe in.
I just want to tell,
providing.
before you go any further,
Yeah.
I'm up for it. We're up for it. Whatever you do differently, we want to experiment too. What do you guys want?
We can be.
You want
We can be friends. There can be a few benefits, John. Friends with benefits, but not. I'm not going to commit all the way. Benefits of trade, benefits of defense.
right.
Yeah.
No, we'll be cool about it. We won't levy tariffs on all your goods as retribution for you not going out with us. We respect your boundaries.
All right, so this is near the beginning of the interview, and I was expecting, before watching this, I was expecting a cringe fest, because that's typically what happens when a politician speaks to Jon Stewart, because Jon Stewart is loose, funny, normal, and politicians tend to be very clean-cut, rehearsed, stay on message. But Mark Carney actually seems like somewhat of a normal person, has a sense of humor, and these are qualities that I think Pierre Poilievre and Trudeau both lack. So he really stands out here. Now, this kind of demeanor has to continue. If he's just this way on Jon Stewart's show, but then he announces a run for leadership and turns into your typical politician and is on a debate stage with, the other potential leadership candidates, or if he goes on to win the leadership race on a stage with Pierre Poilievre and they're both just robots, it's not going to play anymore. But if he's able to continue being normal, this is going to work very well for him. Now, let me get to the next clip. This is where Jon Stewart talks about, Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre and clowns Poilievre a little bit.
I want to show this. This is, so Trudeau, obviously. The other guy is Pierre Poilievre. It looks like, and he is Trudeau's rival, yes? They look like two fictional boys' school rivals in like Poilievre seems like a villain in a like Karate Kid movie. Like there's something very, very off-putting. What is he like in person?
Karate.
Take your time.
You're not far off. I'll say this.
Yes.
There is a type of politician. You have a few of them here in the United States. I think we just
Stop it.
Yeah. They had a lot in and around Brexit.
Yes.
And we have Mr. Poilievre. In Canada, a type of politician who's, tend to be lifelong politician.
Really?
Tend to worship the market. They've never actually worked in the private sector.
Right.
And they see opportunity in tragedy, like you just had with the California fires, these horrible fires.
Correct.
And they see opportunity in tragedy to push an agenda that, here's one they prepared earlier,
right.
and they fit it in. And so whether it was Brexit, here often, the starve the beast type approach. So Pierre Poilievre, when COVID started, his reaction was, this is a good time to cut spending and cut taxes. Everyone's just been pushed out of a job. Nobody's got work. So let's cut the taxes on the work they don't have, and let's take away the social safety net when everybody's vulnerable.
Wow.
Yeah.
I got to say, he nails Pierre Poilievre here. I got a bit on Poilievre. So this is near the beginning of the pandemic. This is March 2020. Pierre Poilievre is asked if he supports special measures in the March budget to help Canadians deal with COVID-19. This is what he said at the time.
I just want to be clear about something about the upcoming budget. Do you or don't you want to see special measures in there now? Because one would think that the federal government will have to have some for the country to deal with COVID-19.
I've just listed when you asked the question the first time, I answered it by saying that yes, we do believe that we need to lower taxes, eliminate regulatory red tape.
That doesn't exactly address COVID-19, though. In all
actually,
fairness,
in fairness, it might not address it the way you want to address it. You might want to address it through big fat government programs. We're conservatives, so we don't believe in that.
Big fat government programs like the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which was the $2,000 a month that helped people get through the pandemic when they didn't have a job. Pierre Poilievre was against this at the time. Now, it's funny because he goes on, like later on during the pandemic, he then complains, people aren't getting enough money. But then also at the same time now, he's complaining that the government spent too much during the pandemic. Like, the guy is all over the place. He's trying to be all things to everyone. And if you actually go through the history of what he says over the course of the past, several years, he is just back and forth all over the place. Because again, he's trying to appeal to various audiences. And at the same time, he maintains his real ideology is that conservative ideology that Mark Carney talked about, where you see him trying to fit it in to the pandemic here, where, cut taxes, cut regulations. Like, what does this have to do with helping people during the pandemic when they've lost their job or they can't work? Like, he's so out of touch with what people actually need, which is why you've seen this transformation, both, visually of Pierre Poilievre. You see how he looks now, but also this transformation in his rhetoric over the past couple of years, where he is now pretending to care about the working class, discussing issues like the high cost of housing and the high price of food, pretending that he has solutions to those problems when his solutions are no different than what he was proposing back then about, cutting taxes. The issue is low wages. The issue is high cost of housing. How do you address those specific things? You don't do it by furthering your emboldenment of massive corporations and their takeover of industries. You do it by actually regulating those industries. It would be nice if there'd be some, public housing, social housing included in that as well. Look at a place like Vienna and what they've done with housing. But there are ways to address these problems that aren't specific to conservative policy. And in fact, conservative policy, especially during the pandemic, would have made things even worse, as is broken down here. This is from the Canadian Union of Public Employees. So they break down how Pierre Poilievre is wrong about inflation, where he, at the time, this is a couple of years ago, March 2023, arguing that the Bank of Canada caused inflation by printing money to fund government spending. As such, he says the way to fight inflation is to impose legal limits on government spending, but neither of those claims hold up. Going on to write, first, recent price increases have been caused primarily by pandemic-related supply shortages. To make things even worse, corporations in critical sectors used supply chain issues as an excuse to increase their own profit margins. A report by the Center for Future Work found that 15 sectors dramatically increased their profit margins in 2022, including oil and gas extraction and refining, financial institutions, motor vehicle dealers, food manufacturers, and food retailers. In some of these sectors, a small number of businesses control most of the market, making it much less competitive and easier for companies to profiteer. But that would require Pierre Poilievre to criticize massive corporations, which, again, is not part of his ethos. They also go on to right here. And by the way, I'll link to this below the video. It's worth reading the entire thing just to see the breakdown. But just to highlight this as well, while Pierre Poilievre is right that inflation is a problem, he's wrong about the answers. The sharp increase in global oil prices, for example, is due to supply chain issues and profiteering. The amount of money our government spends has no effect on these prices. Moreover, temporarily increasing the money supplied during the pandemic helped avoid an increase in bankruptcies and longer-term economic destruction. If we had limited government spending during the pandemic, like Poilievre says we should have done, we would have not been able to fund programs like CERB or CERB, like I showed you earlier, that helped households and small businesses survive the crisis. So these solutions that Pierre Poilievre has, which he doesn't talk about very often, he focuses strategic, which is, I should say, a strategic move, focusing more on the problems because he's absolutely correct about the problems. High cost of housing, high cost of living. He focuses on a lot of those problems. But then his solution is cut the carbon tax, which if you, as I've shown before, I should have brought it up here. Maybe I'll show it on screen. There have been breakdowns of this. The carbon tax is not the problem. In fact, many people get more money back from the rebates of the carbon tax than they pay into it over the course of a year. So the carbon tax is not the problem here. The problem is these massive companies taking advantage of people. And of course, high cost of housing, which can be addressed in a variety of other ways that he is not addressing. But this goes to who he is. The Breach has done several great pieces on Pierre Poilievre. 10 mansions that common man, quote unquote, Pierre Poilievre has fundraised in. So I'll link to this below the video. It's a fun read. Also, this one, corporate lobbyists are flocking to Pierre Poilievre's Cash for Access fundraisers. More than 100 active or recent corporate lobbyists have attended the Conservative Party's Cash for Access fundraiser since Pierre Poilievre became leader. This one I covered in a video probably about 6 months ago. But just quickly here, so this includes lobbyists for oil and natural gas resource companies, big banks, telecoms, large retailers, and real estate investors. This guy claiming he cares about the high cost of housing, meeting with real estate investors, paid for entry to private Cash for Access fundraisers with Pierre Poilievre held across the country. So again, I'll link to this below the video as well. Let me get to the next clip.
Canadians have been very hard pressed in the last few years.
Right.
Wages have not kept up with inflation. People are falling behind, not getting ahead. Housing's very expensive, and there's this broader concern. Again, exclamation point put on by the Trump tariffs about what the future brings. The world's more divided. It's more dangerous. Mm-hmm. What are we going to do? And truth be told, the government has been not as focused on those issues as it could be. We need to focus on them immediately. That can happen now, and that's what this election is going to be about.
Can I tell you something? I feel like I'm looking in a mirror. We just had that election.
Yeah.
Run. And when I say run, I mean not for office. I mean run the other way. It's so hard. It's when the headwinds are like that. It's really difficult for a candidate to come in who is saddled with the policies that are
But let's say.
Oh boy.
Let's say, just throwing out a
Look
wild.
Look at you trying to preserve the relationship all of a sudden.
A wild hypothetical. Let's say the candidate wasn't part of the government. Let's say the candidate did have a lot of economic experience. Let's say the candidate did deal with crises. Let's say the candidate had a plan to deal with the challenges in the here and now.
Sneaky, you're running as an outsider.
I am an outsider.
Are you? So this gets to, I mean, clearly Mark Carney there all but announces the fact that he is going to be running for the leadership, and I'll get to a headline in a second here on that. But this gets to what is going to be the attempt by the Conservative Party to pigeonhole him as somebody who is not an outsider. Because on one hand, he is an outsider in terms of electoral politics. He's not a sitting politician. He's not an MP. He is coming from the outside in that sense. At the same time, he is the former governor of the Bank of Canada. Not necessarily the typical outsider role. So actually, I want to credit David Moscrop here because he tweeted this out, saying, whether you like Carney or not, God, I hope we can agree a central banker, asset management company chair, and Liberal Party advisor is not an outsider. Don't let his outsider narrative set in. Going on to write, I think we owe it to ourselves to press beyond taking the narrative bait and doing an analysis of politics that is pure aesthetics. We can't drop the aesthetics because they matter despite what anyone might prefer, but we'd be served to dig a little deeper than that. I agree. He's correct. That said, it's important to think about this in the context of what is going to happen, which is an election where Pierre Poilievre is the leader of the Conservative Party. Pierre Poilievre, a career politician, which I have no issue with career politicians if your career was spent actually helping people. But if your career was spent like Pierre Poilievre's, which is working on behalf of big business and against the working class, voting against unions, voting against abortion rights, voting against cannabis legalization, if that has been your role as a politician, that's not good. So for me, it's less about outsider, insider, because you could argue, of course, Mark Carney in some way is not an outsider. For me, it's more about the fact that you have someone here who has the potential to avoid a worst case scenario, which is a conservative majority government. Look, it's going to be hard. Let's be real here. It's going to be very hard for anybody to come into this as the Liberal leader and somehow win again. Like this, you would have to make leaps, massive leaps in support in a very short time to be able to form government. But there is the potential, if you are good enough as a leader and there is a clear vision and something that people can actually attach themselves to, and you come off as somebody who is real and not fake, there is the potential to avoid a worst case scenario being a conservative majority government. It's just a matter of, can he pull it off in such a short time? So that's my focus right now. There'll be plenty of time for criticism of Mark Carney after an election, but my focus right now is avoiding a conservative majority government where Pierre Poilievre's answer has been austerity. That's been his view, his entire career, and that clearly is not the solution to anything. So the Hill Times headline here, Carney expected to launch Liberal leadership bid in Edmonton on Thursday. Clearly, this interview with Jon Stewart was timed accordingly. And from what I'm reading online, impressions from people, whether their politics are in the center or to the left, everybody appears to be impressed by this interview with Jon Stewart. And I think it really comes down to the fact that Carney just came off as somebody who is more of a person. Because not in terms of actual policy, not much was said during that interview. But if you put Carney up to someone like, again, Poilievre or Trudeau, he just comes off as more real. A person with a sense of humor can, hold a conversation, is not robotic, is not rehearsed. If he can manage to continue that, I think he can do very well. Because we are in an era right now where people are just so tired of typical politicians, where they'll even vote for someone who's clearly a fraud in Donald Trump because he does not fit the mold of your typical politician. But if you have somebody who can maintain, some semblance of a personality while also not being a maniac, I think that's a good combination for both a leadership bid and potentially prime minister.